of Toledo's innovation legacy, please welcome my friend, Matt Buchanan.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. I love you, man. All right, so a disclaimer at the start here. This has changed a little bit considering the technology issues, so I'm going to read my notes a little bit more than I would normally because I don't have them up here. So bear with me on that. Anyways, thanks, Gene. Thanks to Startup Toledo. You guys are an amazing organization. We're so happy to be a sponsor, and look at the crowd. I love what you guys do and love that you keep doing it. Thanks to everyone else for coming to our office. I know it's raining outside, and thank you for coming. It's not snow, at least, right? At least not yet. So when Gene asked me to talk a while back, I told him, I said, you sure? If I talk about patents, I'll pretty much guarantee you the lowest turnout ever in startup history. Luckily, Gene disagreed, and he pushed back a little bit, and he told me, no, we need you to do this. So here we are. I'm going to talk about patents, and actually I'm not going to talk about just patents. I'm going to talk about really, really old patents. So that sounds exciting, right? And I'm going to coordinate a little bit here because now I got to do this instead of that. So before I get into that, though, I want to give you a little bit of context, a little bit of background. So 18, I'm born and raised in Toledo. I lived here as a child growing up from ages 0 to 18. Spent my whole life here up to age 18, except for a small stint in Texas. My dad is here, so he can tell you about that. He's the one that took us down there. And then eventually at 18, I left for Columbus to go to Ohio State. So 40 is an estimate. 40 is, I estimate, the grand total number of hours that I spent in downtown Toledo in all of those 18 years. And I actually think it's probably pretty high. So south-north, I grew up in the south end. My grandparents, where my father grew up, north end. So we would crisscross town all the time, driving from the south to go to grandma's house in the north and then back home. Most of those 40 hours were us driving through downtown. And we never stopped. There was nothing to do in downtown Toledo. I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, and in those years, there was nothing down here. You kind of just flew right through downtown Toledo. So the last one, I'm going to trip over this eventually. The last number, 2. When I was growing up as a kid in Toledo, I was taught that Toledo was famous for 2 big inventions and innovations. Any guesses?
Glass.
The title kind of gives it away, right? All right. Jeeps and glass, of course. Don't get me wrong. I was brought up properly. I was taught about all sorts of things from Toledo. Tony Pacos, Swain Field, all these wonderful threads in our history here. But as far as inventions and innovations go, I was taught that these were our 2 big hits. And that was it. But I managed to learn about a few other, kind of big things along the way. I was taught, or not taught, but I just kind of picked up on it, some other points of pride that we have. Scales and spark plugs. Toledo scale, no longer in Toledo. Spark plugs, Champion spark plug, no longer in Toledo. So I learned a few of those things. So in my 20s, this is where I was as a native Toledoan. My hometown had taught me to be proud of our native Jeeps and our native glass. And it also taught me that nothing ever happens in downtown Toledo. And then in my 30s, my lovely wife, Renee, and I, we moved away. We went off to Chicago, and I thought that was the end of Toledo for me. Turns out it wasn't. So after a few years in Chicago, we decided to move back to be closer to family. We didn't know how the job situation would work out, but we committed to figuring it out. In my early years as a patent attorney, I had kind of gotten in and done some really nerdy and geeky stuff, and I got into reading old patents and learning about technology and the progression of technology over time. So as I came back to Toledo, I thought, well, one of the things I could do is, why don't I learn a little bit about Jeeps and glass? I want to read some of the old Jeep patents, and I want to read some of the old glass patents. So I did. So as a way to reconnect with my hometown, coming back, I read all kinds of patents on drivetrains and electric vehicle lights and glass containers for perfume and fruit trays and all these goofy things. But occasionally, I would find some other patents. Kind of came up in my searches. And I just kind of threw them off to the side, usually. But after a while, I started realizing, boy, there's a whole bunch of these other things. I should start looking at that pile. So I started getting into the stories that those patents told me. Totally different technologies. I started looking into the inventors and their companies and the stories behind those patents. And that's for the first time, and I'm probably, mid-30s at this point, for the first time in my life as a native Toledoan, that I actually appreciated the incredible history of innovation that this city has. So, I learned, and I continue to learn. I told you I'm on a trip. And I continue to learn that Toledo has played a role in launching all sorts of amazing technology. This is meant to be a little bit of a joke. It's okay to laugh. This is meant to be a little bit of a joke. This is not some high-tech invention. This is from the early 1900s. This is not some high-tech, complicated invention. This is something extremely simple and actually a little bit silly. It's a Halloween mask, but I actually use this for a point. It's meant to illustrate this point. In the early 1900s, even the silly things that were happening in Toledo were a huge deal. Toledo, and I bet nobody in this room knows this, Toledo actually gave birth to the Halloween merchandise industry. The very first manufactured Halloween items came from a company called the Toledo Metal Sign Company. And it was the very first product that they put out was a metal jack-o'-lantern. And the entire industry took off right here in Toledo, turn of the century, 1900s. So from there, we've got all kinds of other industries that actually started in Toledo, or actually took some major developments in Toledo. And these are the things I started reading about. These are some other quick examples of inventions from Toledo that played a key role either in the launching of an industry or kind of a major turn for an industry. Dental chairs and barber furniture, actually out in Maumee of all places. Up on the top, billiards tables. There was a company in downtown Toledo that had all sorts of innovations in billiards tables. Vacuum cleaners, the very first disposable vacuum cleaner bag, Toledo, Ohio. Downtown Toledo, Ohio, actually. And one of my favorites, I'm not going to talk too much about it tonight, but one of my favorites, Toledo was actually the center of the fountain pen industry for a pretty good chunk of time. The Conklin Pen Company introduced this particular innovation, and it completely changed the industry. Mark Twain used to endorse these pens from Toledo, Ohio. And actually, I think, as far as I can tell, their building is where the stadium is now. So that's a building that we've lost. But they had a huge concern here in Toledo. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to detail a few of my favorites. Those are favorites, obviously, but these are other favorites I'd like to give a little bit more detail on. As you can probably tell, I like a little bit of the lesser-known stories. Not the Jeeps, not the glass, but some of the lesser-known things. But I want you to know, these aren't small ideas in any way, shape, or form. And they're not, it doesn't mean that they're worthy of less attention. In fact, each of the following examples was a huge deal in its time. So this does not say huge forks. I'm not going to tell you that Toledo invented those giant forks that were all on the wall in your grandmother's kitchen. Or maybe that was just my grandmother, I don't know. But no, this is meant to just be kind of an introduction here. So technology usually progresses along a linear path, or mostly linear path, little curves here and there for the most part. But it's usually very small incremental changes that kind of follow each other, and you'll see a curve here and a curve there, but for the most part, it's going in the same direction. Occasionally, someone comes along and they introduce a fork in the process, and the fork takes a very sudden, dramatic turn off of that path and turns things in another direction. Sometimes those forks are just flat out crazy and everybody ignores it and we say, we're going back down this path. Other times, the fork becomes the new path. Those are the huge innovations. Those are the innovations that literally change an industry or sometimes create an entire new industry. So the examples that I'm going to go through tonight, every single one of these is one of those forks. They took a dramatic turn in their particular industry, and they all happened right here in Toledo. And I will also tell you that these are just a few. This happened over and over and over again. So I'm betting I'm the first one to ever tell everybody in this room the modern roller coaster was invented in Toledo, Ohio. The modern roller coaster was invented in Toledo, Ohio. So roller coasters in the late 1800s were, for the most part, little tiny railroads. They went along a straight line. They might have had a hill here and there, but they went along a straight line. You got in the cars here, you took your nice little ride, and at the end of the track, you got out. Then they had a problem to deal with. They're like, well, what do we do? How do we get more people to do this? So weirdly, they created something called the switchback. And the switchback was they would put it on another rail and they'd send it back that way. This is like a textbook example of obviousness, a patent law concept. But anyways, they'd send it back that way. I kid you not, in the late 1800s, a Toledo inventor named Alanson Wood came along. And he said, this is kind of ridiculous. Why don't you put it in a loop? I told you, it's a textbook example of obvious. And he said, well, as long as we're going in a loop, why don't I start the ride at a relatively high elevation, and I'll leverage gravity a little bit, and we'll go down a little hill. And then we'll come across some hills along the way, and that's kind of fun for people. And then at the end, it'll circle back, and it goes right back to the same platform. And then they'd kind of wrench it up so it gets back up to that elevated platform. That invention was made by Mr. Wood in Toledo, Ohio. And if you think about it, that's every roller coaster you ever ride still today. He was the first one to come up with that very simple concept. Unfortunately, as is all too common, Mr. Wood was probably a better inventor than he was business person. He struggled to get his roller coasters built. He struggled to get them installed. And in fact, there were some groups out on the East Coast, Coney Island and all that stuff, that kind of took some technology, probably incorporated his ideas into their ideas, and they ran with it, and they kind of became the winner of that race. But the fact is he was the first one to invent that concept. Don't feel too bad for him, though. He made enough money from licensing this off that Mr. Wood was able to finance his inventive activities for the rest of his life. He basically became an individual, fully financed inventor on his own. And this guy is fantastic. This guy, I always envision this guy as like a Doc from Back to the Future kind of guy. With like crazy wild hair and a lab coat and all this stuff. He invented some stuff relating to roller skates, did all kinds of goofy things. I think the goofiest thing he did, and this is off the patents, but it's a great story, is he started building a flying machine. In Toledo, he built what he called his aerodome in downtown Toledo, and that's where he was working on his, quote, flying machine. And his goal was, in the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, they were having a contest for dirigibles. And you had to go down so far and go around something and come back and lift things up out of the air and all that. And there was actually a guy from Brazil that had been winning these contests all over the world. And he was kind of the hands-on favorite because no one had competed with him. Well, in 1902, when Mr. Wood's working on his, there's articles all over the place saying this Brazilian's going to get stiff competition in St. Louis because Mr. Wood from Toledo, Ohio is showing up with his flying machine. And Mr. Wood did a great job of telling everybody, I've got this great innovation, this is going to change everything, I figured it out, no one else knows how to do it. What is it? I'm not going to tell you. There's no record that he ever showed up at the World's Fair. He died like in 1909, so he actually lived during the time of the World's Fair. I don't think that was the problem. But there's no record that he actually showed up. I don't know if he ever actually competed in that or not. The prize, though, $200,000 in 1904. So you can imagine the motivation that he had to go for that. But he just kind of falls out of the records, and I don't know what happens to it. Still to this day, I think somewhere in downtown Toledo, there's an old, quote, flying machine in a basement somewhere. So keep your eyes out. All right. Gene, this is your moment.
Do you want to sing? Do I get to
So when I first told Gene about a few of my stories, when we were talking about what we were going to talk about and everything, Gene's kind of like, oh yeah, patents, this and that. And then I said, I can connect Toledo innovation to ABBA. And all of a sudden, Gene's eyes light right up. He's all over that. He's all excited about that. Do you want to sing? You're welcome to. On the next slide. Oh no, here it is. Later, okay. All right. I'm not going to sing. I'm not going to play the song either because I'm an IP attorney. But here's the opening lyrics to ABBA's song, Super Trooper. In ABBA's song, Super Trooper, you can see the second line. Super Trooper beams are gonna blind me, right? They're talking about being on stage and the spotlight's coming at them. This is what that's about. The Super Trooper lights. So Harry Strong was a doorbell repairman in Toledo, Ohio. He repaired doorbells. And he also tinkered on the side. He was a classic garage inventor. He eventually founded the Strong Electric Corporation, which actually had offices at the block down there in St. Clair Street on the other side. Harry Strong invented a series of lights for the entertainment industry over decades, 1900s to 1950s or so, where he was kind of, coming down, but the company was still going on. And in 1956, the Strong Electric Corporation introduced the Super Trooper Spotlight. And at the time, the Super Trooper Spotlight was known as the brightest stage spotlight in the world. And that's the inspiration for that song. But Harry Strong did all kinds of cool things around Toledo. So he tested, every time he had a new prototype, he tested it in local theaters. And there's records of him going out to the Maumee Indoor Theater and doing some tests out there. Strong Electric actually did so well, they grew to a point in Toledo, in downtown Toledo, where they were actually acquiring companies from all over the country. They folded in several other concerns from all over the country. And they did more than that. They moved manufacturing operations from those companies to Toledo, which is something we don't hear about too often anymore. And along the way, they inspired the ABBA song, of course. In this little fact here, I'm told, I have not seen these, but I've been told, that there's actually many famous performers over the decades that in their entertainment contracts, they will actually have riders in their contracts with the venues. And they will say, the only spotlight that is to be put on me is a Super Trooper light because of the favorable light that it casts on them. So that's pretty cool. Does that look familiar to anyone? The gable-top milk carton was invented in Toledo, Ohio. In the early 1900s, John Van Warmer, who actually owned a toy factory in town, invented the gable-top milk container, which is still in use today, if you think about it. These things are still out there. I contend, actually, I think this is probably one of the most widely used inventions in the history of everything. I mean, everybody in developed countries, at least, has come across these things and probably sworn at them and they're horrible. I hate them. I can never open them properly. I feel like I'm drinking some of the cardboard and all, whatever. But they were started right here in Toledo, Ohio. And from a technology progression point of view, this is actually really one of my favorites because the story goes, and these are all legend and lore, but the story goes is he was in his kitchen one day getting milk from the glass milk jar, a milk bottle, and he dropped it and it shattered all over the floor, and that was kind of the aha moment, I got to come up with something. He spent years working on this because another part of the invention was they were flat shipped. So at the dairy they could build them over there and you could ship more to them. So he spent years and years and years figuring this out. It looks like a simple invention, but it actually took quite a bit of engineering to figure out. But what he was doing was he was trying to disrupt another industry that was also centered here in Toledo, the glass industry. When you've got one inventor trying to disrupt another industry that's taken hold in your own town, that's when you know you've really got it going on. In Toledo in the early 1900s, that's what we had going on. That was pretty cool. His name was John Van Warmer. But My all-time favorite, at least for now, Toledo innovation story has to be the American Floor Surfacing Machine Company. Boy, they knew how to brand things back in there, right? I mean, come on, that's awesome. So why is this my favorite? There's literally dozens of reasons, but I'll give you a couple as we go. First of all, the really cool thing, as Gene alluded to, most of this story, and most is an important word there, most of this story happened a couple blocks from where we're all standing right now. At the end of St. Clair Street, where St. Clair kind of runs into the expressway, there's a block of buildings there, and it was that entire block down there, on this side of it, it was that entire block that over the years, American Floor kind of built up and had as their headquarters. You know the building, it's the one with the big sign on top of it right now. I can't remember what it says, but it's, you know the building. It's kind of loud and, you know. Anyways, American Floor, and now you'll see some of the other reasons that makes this my favorite. The American Floor story goes like this. It started in Stanford University in California. So there was a contractor working on a job at Stanford, doing a rehab on a building or something like that. And they got to the end of the job, and they realized that they hadn't put in enough money to complete the resurfacing of the wood floors in the buildings. Keep in mind, before American Floor came along, the way you resurfaced a wood floor was you hired a bunch of people, and they came in with blades, and they scraped a little bit off the top of the floor, and then hand sanded it, and then they put a new finish on it. Very labor intensive, not something you want to have to get into if you've run out of money in the budget for the job. So this developer was in a little, or this contractor was in a little bit of a crunch. So the story goes, he went and he found a local inventor, and he asked him, how can I figure out a better way to do this? Because I'm in a jam. I got to come up with something that kind of helps me out here. They worked together, and they actually invented the world's first floor resurfacing machine, a floor sander. It's the first one. They invented it, and they invented it in San Francisco. They did quite well. The first ones were these huge monstrosities that you actually got on top of or alongside of, and you rode them. I always envision this as like a tiny mini little Zamboni kind of thing. But for a couple years in San Francisco, they made these and they had some success. They did well. But they had bigger visions and they knew, hey, we're onto something here. Let's build a bigger company. So they moved to Toledo. Because if you're doing that sort of thing in 1905, you will do better in Toledo, is what they were told. So they did. Lock, stock, and barrel, they picked the company up and they moved it to Toledo, Ohio. They set up shop at the end of St. Clair Street, probably not the end at that time, I know the expressway cut it in half, but down on St. Clair Street. And that's where they got underway. Excuse me while I bring this back up. So they had, so that's another point that makes this one of my favorites. Here's another one. So there's a Blade article from the 1950s that talks about American Floor because it was their 50th anniversary at the time. 50th anniversary of being in Toledo. So there's a big write-up about it. 1953 is the date of this article. And in that article, they tell this story, by the way. But they also talk about the year before, so 1952. They were cleaning out the attic of the Spitzer building, and they came across one of those Zamboni-like sanders. It's the only one at the time, so in 1952, known to be in existence. The company had lost them all. They had no records of where they were at, so they only had one. They found it in the Spitzer building. That model was known as the Big American. And the serial number on the one they found in the Spitzer building was number 142. So Big American number 142 was found in the attic of the Spitzer building in 1952. And it was out of service, obviously. The Spitzer folks weren't using it anymore. It had just kind of been put up there in storage. So along come some folks from Romanoff Electric. which was a concern at the time. They came and they said, this is this amazing story of Toledo innovation, even though the Big American was invented in San Francisco. Their later things were invented here. But they said, we want that. So they took it. I assume they bought it from the Spitzer guys. But they took it and they did some restoration on it. And then they displayed it in their offices as kind of like this showpiece of Toledo innovation. This is still in the 1950s, so some cool things are still happening here in the 1950s. But the current location of Big American number 142 is unknown. When I first found this article, you know how many Romanoff electrics there are in town? It's not just one anymore. There's several. I called them all, and I had several really interesting conversations, some of which were helpful, some of which not so much. I got in touch with a few people who actually got excited about this stuff. And they're like, I'm telling you, if we had that thing, we would know. It's not something you just kind of hide and don't realize. No idea where this thing is at today. So I'm still looking for Big American number 142. So a few weeks ago, after Gene had asked me to do this talk, light bulb finally goes off in my head, and I was like, I got to call. The building is for sale, by the way, and phone numbers are posted on the side of the building. So I said, you know what, I'm going to call, and I'm going to ask whoever this owner is. I didn't know him at the time. I said, I'm going to ask him if he'll let us go in there and just kind of poke around a little bit. I call Art, and I have a great conversation with Art. Art turns out to be a history guy as well. He knows the whole history of American floor, of his buildings. And he was all into it. And I told him and he's like, this is really strange. This attorney's calling me. I don't know what's going on. What are you going to do? And I said, no, we just want to come and poke around in your building and, take pictures and stuff like that. Would that be okay? And Art was like, sure, why not? Hang up the phone, and we're like, we'll figure out details later. He calls me later in the afternoon, and he says, I need you to contact my attorney first and just make sure that, remember the quote. So I coordinated with my good friend Chad. His attorney's over at Marshall & Melhorn. We talked that through, and Art was comfortable with us going through his building. So a couple weeks ago, Andrew Weber and I and Gene met Art down there on a Saturday, and we just kind of poked around his building. And Art was so kind. He's the kindest guy in the world. He walked us through the entire building, starting at the very far end, which is where Art has done a lot of work. And he's restored it, and it's kind of modernized and cleaned up and all of that, and it looks great. In the middle of the building, and as we're walking through, Art keeps telling me, there's one of those Sanders in this building somewhere. So right away, I'm kind of on high alert. I'm like, Big American number 139, maybe? I don't know. But I'm all excited, which I know is really nerdy and geeky, but I was totally excited about that. So we kind of let Art do his thing, and he walked us through all the newer areas of the building. He was really proud of showing us that. We just kind of wanted to get to the other parts. But we let him show us all the new parts and all of that, which was fantastic. Gradually, we made our way to the middle of the block of buildings down there. The middle of that block, I think, is where they actually had their corporate headquarters. So these are the offices and things. And I'm telling you, the middle of this building, this block of buildings, is a complete and total time capsule. The woodworking on the wall, the offices, they had dumbwaiters going from the offices down to, I assume, like the production area. They had a bookkeeper's cage where we were thinking people went, maybe got their pay for the week. I mean, the marble staircase up the middle of this. You go in the restroom, we never found the men's. We found the women's. You go in the women's restroom, marble. Every wall, floor, the stalls. It was beautiful. The kind of thing you only see in federal government buildings, old federal government buildings these days. I mean, it was absolutely astonishing. It was just absolutely beautiful. But still, we wanted to move on because we were like, well, we got to get to the other part because that's where this Sanders got to be. And Art keeps telling us, yeah, there's one of those Sanders in this building. So we're like, well, let's move on. So then we get down. This is the part that is farthest from the expressway. We finally get to these areas, and I'm talking about this one in particular, the second one in. We get in there, and Art kind of warns us, and he says, this part, not so good. Get ready. There's no light in here. The floor has holes everywhere, so be careful where you walk. Oh, by the way, the Sanders on the second floor, so we will be going up to floors that matter. Staircases have nails in them, all this kind of thing. And we go in. And we're walking through this, and he's right. There's no light. The floor is kind of spongy. We're walking around. We start from the third floor, so we kind of walk right past the second, even though we knew that's where the sander was. And it was amazing. But I kid you not, as we walk through it, Art is literally telling us, don't step there, step there. Because if you step there, you're going back to the first floor. In the express elevator. Eventually, we get down to the second floor, and we could see they had parts bins there where they had done some activity and probably moved things down the line and everything. But that's where we found the sander. It's not a big American. So I was disappointed. It wasn't the Zamboni model, which is what I'm totally after. But nevertheless, this is one of their, they later become American Lincoln, by the way. But this is one of their floor sanders in its home, in its own environment. And Art was so kind to tell me, you're all into this stuff, you can have it. So sooner or later, and I'm taking these guys with me, we're going back to get this thing out.
I'm not going back.
I had hoped to have this thing here tonight, but it just didn't work out. But what I can tell you is, we went to kind of pivot it to see, how easy this is going to be when we finally get around to doing this. I forget who did. It was one of these. It was not me, but it was one of these two. Kind of wrenched down on the handle to lift up the back. I kid you not, the floor came with the machine. So the irony is the floor surfacing machine became the floor over the years, and it might have created a new hole in the floor there. I don't know the vintage on this one. Just guessing and looking at it, I'm thinking late 30s, 40s, maybe even up to the 50s or so. Still in its own right, very cool. It's not the big American. I'm still looking for that, and I'm still looking for Mr. Wood's flying machine. So keep your eyes open. If you see strange things like that, I want to know. All right, so last slide. So why do I do this? Why does this matter? Why is this interesting and all of that? And for me anyways, I think we are really lucky as Toledoans because we're living in this era where we're going through a revitalization, a little bit of a rebirth. And that's really cool because if you compare it to the 70s and the 80s when I was growing up, it was just desolate. And it must have not been a great time to be around the city. We're lucky because we're in the time that we are and there's so much new activity going on in downtown. But with that being said, I think that us as Toledoans, we don't give our city a break. We talk down on it a lot. We like to get down on it. I like to say we've got a little bit of a self-image problem. Toledo. So for me, this is one small way for me to combat that. Because as I've learned this history that we've got over the years, I've also learned that there's no other city out there that can match this. And I'm including present-day Silicon Valley. They're a one-hit wonder. I mean, they're still going down the same path, doing a little bit of this, a little bit of that. They're trying to take the automotive industry, and maybe they will. But so far, as they've gone down that technology progression, they've really been on that same path, and they're kind of incrementally advancing it. Toledo, in its heyday, we had forks all over the place, because that's the spirit that was going on at the time. So what I like to say is we've got this unbelievable, amazing history. We do a horrible job of teaching ourselves about it. And I think we need to do a better job of that. I think we need to reconnect with this history. We need to embrace it. We need to celebrate it and be really proud of it. Because like I said, no one can match it. That's it. Thank you. Oh, I have to take questions?
You have to take questions. Anyone? Bueller?
Bueller?
I'll start.
Yes, sir.
Where are we standing right now? When was this?
So this building, I have not verified with this with my own eyes, so legend and lore. But actually, Paul's here. I'm going to lean on Paul for a lot of things. The learned experts in the house. This building, I'm told, was originally a Germanic cultural center. Correct. Third floor was a theater of sorts, stage plays and all sorts of things like that. Over the years, it obviously changed from that. There was a office supply warehouse. I always forget the name. Siebenek. That was a name at the time, big name in Toledo at the time. But this was their warehouse where they had all the office supplies, for shipping out to customers and things like that. When we decided to move down here, they had actually already redone the third floor, which Paul was a big part of. When we started in on the second floor, it had been untouched for decades. I mean, it was just kind of empty. Now, someone was living here a little bit, but they didn't do anything to it. And I don't know there's some interesting stories to that, but so it sat empty for a long period of time. And there's some other things involved in the history of this building that is not mentioned in polite company, I've been told. So yeah. So that's another talk. Yeah.
We had one of those at our end of the street.
There you go. Yeah. They were everywhere, I'm told. I was told this is the part of the town that the cops just kind of said, just let them do their thing.
All those spread from here.
So this building obviously has a very interesting history as well.
Do you just rent the floor, own it? Or?
We've got this entire second floor. Dave Ball is the developer and owner of the building. Yep. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, other than you look at internet from currently or in the past, what industries have been most benefited by patents from Toledo people? Maybe glass would be an obvious one. What are some other industries?
Back in the day, there's so many examples. Like I gave you, the fountain pen industry was huge in Toledo. I mean, you've never heard that, right? I mean, the fountain pen industry was centered in Toledo for a while. Bicycle industry. The bike industry was huge in Toledo for a while. We earned the nickname of the Coventry of America. Coventry over in England was a big center of the bike industry over there. They called Toledo the Coventry of America. Bikes were huge here. Umbrellas. We had umbrella factories, several here in town, that came up with, it's umbrellas, kind of silly technology, but Beer. Tons of breweries around here. In fact, if on your way down to American Floor, on your way out of here, the tall abandoned building that kind of sticks up in an odd shape, that's Russell and Brand. The brewery right down here by the post office. Gosser Brand. Yeah, in Gambling. The creek down here was a big attraction for American Floor because they probably dumped all kinds of, and then breweries, obviously. So, but they were upstream of American Floor, so that's good.
So, for your umbrella thing,
Yeah.
the umbrella thing still exists.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
Every company actually purchased the rights to this umbrella company, and they turned the physical umbrellas into lights or umbrellas for lights.
Yeah.
And they're based in Maumee.
Yep.
Right across from what is it now? It used to be a Jed's.
Yeah.
Or Red Meyer.
Westcott, right? Yep, absolutely. So that's the beautiful thing about this. Every time you pull a little string in Toledo's history, all these crazy things kind of fall out. And that's why I always say there's no other city that kind of matches that with the number. I mean, every city kind of has, this is what we're known for. This is what we kind of invented. This is our guy from the 1900s that did this. We've got tons of that. Yep. Elevators. Yep, absolutely.
Go look at all the old buildings, you'll see how now there's...
Absolutely.
The building's gone now, but it's right on the trail going out to the zoo where the solar field...
That's right. And in fact, you worked there for a time, didn't you? Yep. Yeah.
Toledo scale was huge.
Toledo scale was huge. And the DeVilbiss family, if you follow the family, there are forks that you cannot imagine. I mean, perfume aspirators. Medical devices, all kinds of crazy things. But the scales, obviously, yeah. Too many to count. What you can do is, if you haven't seen it yet, but this piece of art off in the lobby here, is Danny here? Is Danny Herrera here? I haven't seen her. We had local artist Danny Herrera take all these old Toledo patents, and she kind of has her style that she does these pieces in, and she takes, the background is always old newspapers, and she stains them with tea, I think. And then the foreground is something like jeans or zippers or dryer lint or something goofy like that. So when we decided we were moving down here, we went to Danny and we asked her, instead of newspapers, if we printed out all these old patents on just regular old printer paper, do you think it would work? And she was like, I'm in, let's do this. Let's try it. So she did, and it worked out wonderfully. And then she put in the foreground, made out of jeans, the bridge. And in the background, what you see on those are all old Toledo patents. Roughly a couple hundred of them on there. So
there any IP issues with that?
None whatsoever. Yeah.
So from your perspective, beyond like incredible people, was there any distinguishing factor you've been able to identify that was that spurred on all of this age of innovation? Or
Just kind of surmising, I think location played a key role in it. I mean, we are centrally located, we're on the water, we're on the rails at the time. We're close to so many different big cities. I think that was a huge factor. And in fact, in the stories about American Floor, when they moved to from San Francisco to Toledo, they cited that as one of the reasons, because if you want to push product out back in those days, you wanted to be centrally located, and Toledo was that. So I think location was probably a huge factor. Yeah. Yep.
One more quick one, and we'll wrap up.
Yeah.
If people want to go down their own little research rabbit hole,
Yeah.
where do you point them? If we're
Absolutely.
specific.
Yeah, so nowadays, it's really easy, as you can imagine, it's really super easy to do this. Google has done a pretty decent job, not a great job, but a pretty decent job of archiving all old patents. And they've basically put a Google interface on top of all the patents from the United States Patent and Trademark Office forever. So you can go there, go to Google Patents, and that will take you to, I think, patents.google.com, I think. But anyways, there's a Google search box, and then all you're searching are Google's copy of the patent database. And you can type in, Allenson Wood, Toledo. Where this falls down, and this is why I say they did a pretty good job, not a great job, patents after like 1976 or whatever are fully indexed and searchable text, full text. Patents before that are all image-based and OCR-based. So when you get back into the late 1800s and the 1900s, the search terms don't always match up greatly. But it does a pretty decent job. And you can limit it by year, so you could even just search Toledo, Ohio, 1800 to 1915 or something like that. So yeah, makes it pretty easy. And from there you can download PDFs, and then you'll be like me and you'll be reading old patents late at night, which is awesome. Maybe not, I don't know. Not as much as I used to. Not as much as I used to.
Let's give it up for Matt Buchanan.